33 people. That's how many lives she saved before they dragged her to the stake. The plantation records from coastal South Carolina tell of a slave woman whose healing touch became legendary across 3 counties, until the very families she cured turned against her. On the morning of August 14, 1748, guards opened the iron door of the Georgetown District Jail to retrieve the condemned healer for execution. The cell was empty. No broken locks, no tunnel, no accomplice. Just gone. Local magistrates ordered the incident erased from official records, and for nearly 3 centuries, her story remained buried in sealed church archives and private family journals. Tonight, you'll hear what really happened to the woman they called a witch, and why her disappearance terrified an entire community more than any execution ever could. Before we continue with the story of the healer who vanished from a locked cell, if you're fascinated by mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about American history, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? I love hearing where my audience discovers these forgotten tales. Now, let's step back to 1731, to a place where survival meant understanding the fine line between gift and curse. What the Georgetown magistrates couldn't erase, however, were the whispered accounts that survived in family Bibles, in marginalia of ledgers, in letters tucked between pages of forgotten books. And it's from these fragments that we piece together what truly happened. The settlement that would become Georgetown sat like a jewel along the Winyah Bay, where 4 rivers converged to create one of the finest natural harbors on the Atlantic coast. By 1731, Rice had transformed the Low Country into a landscape of engineered waterways and vast plantations that stretched inland for miles. The humid air hung thick with mosquitoes and money, both equally relentless. The Fairmont plantation occupied nearly 800 acres of prime tidal land, its rice fields organized in a geometric pattern that would have impressed any European engineer. The main house, built of cypress and tabby, that distinctive mixture of oyster shells, sand and lime, stood 2 stories tall with wide piazzas designed to catch the slightest breeze. Inside, imported furniture from England mixed with pieces crafted by skilled enslaved carpenters whose names would never appear in any record book. Jonathan Fairmont had inherited the property from his father, along with 63 enslaved people, whose value on paper exceeded the land itself. He was 29 years old, educated at the College of William and Mary, and possessed that particular combination of ambition and insecurity common to second sons of wealthy families. His wife, Catherine, was 16 when they married, the daughter of a Charleston merchant whose fortune came from the triangular trade. She had pale skin that burned easily in the Carolina sun and a persistent cough that the local physician attributed to weakness of constitution. The enslaved community at Fairmont lived in 2 rows of small cabins behind the main house, far enough for propriety, but close enough for quick summons. They worked the rice fields during the day, back-breaking labor in water that reached their thighs, under a sun that could kill a man in hours. At night, they maintained their own small gardens, their own customs, their own quiet acts of resistance. Sarah arrived in early spring of 1731, sold from a plantation in Virginia after her previous owner died intestate. The bill of sale listed her age as approximately 25, her condition as healthy, her skills as domestic work. It mentioned nothing about the small leather pouch she wore around her neck, or the knowledge she carried that couldn't be appraised or inventoried. She was tall for a woman of her time, with hands that moved with peculiar precision when she touched anything green and growing. Her eyes held something that made people uncomfortable. Not defiance exactly, but an unsettling quality of observation, as if she saw more than what appeared on the surface. She spoke little during those first weeks, learning the rhythms of Fairmont, the personalities that ruled it, the small tyrannies and larger cruelties that structured each day. It was one of the field workers, a man named Thomas, whose legs bore the scars of shackle sores that never fully healed, who first saw what she could do. He'd cut his hand badly on an oyster shell while repairing one of the trunk gates that controlled water flow into the rice fields. The wound festered in the heat, turning angry red, then black at the edges. The overseer, a Scotsman named Duncan MacLeish, noted it in his log but did nothing. A dead slave was expensive, but so was the doctor's time. Thomas showed the wound to Sarah one evening after the work bell rang. She examined it without speaking, then disappeared into the woods beyond the slave quarters. She returned an hour later with a handful of plants that looked like common weeds to anyone else. Using a flat stone, she crushed certain leaves into a paste, mixed it with clean water from the well, and bound the mixture against his wound with strips of cloth. Within 3 days, the black had retreated. Within a week, the wound closed. Within 2 weeks, Thomas could grip an axe handle without wincing. Word spread quickly through the quarters, the way important information always traveled. In glances, in deliberately casual conversation, in the careful code that the enslaved developed to protect what mattered. Others came to her with their ailments. A woman suffering from fever following childbirth. A child with a cough that wouldn't stop. An elderly man with joints so swollen he could barely walk. Sarah treated them all, usually at night, usually in silence. She never asked for payment. What could they give? But recipients left small gifts anyway. A carved wooden spoon, a handful of rice saved from their rations, a scrap of blue cloth. The first time anyone from the main house noticed was in July, when the overseer MacLeish developed a stomach complaint so severe he couldn't leave his small house near the rice mill. For 2 days, he writhed in agony, while his assistant sent a messenger to Georgetown for the doctor. But the doctor was attending a difficult childbirth 20 miles away and wouldn't come. One of the house slaves, a woman named Betty, who'd watched Sarah work, suggested quietly to Catherine Fairmont that perhaps Sarah knew something about healing. Catherine, desperate as her husband grew increasingly angry about the plantation's halted supervision, agreed. Sarah examined the overseer with the same careful attention she gave everyone. His symptoms suggested something he'd eaten, combined with the brackish water from the well near the rice fields. She prepared a tea from bark she gathered from specific trees, added roots dug from specific spots in the forest, and made him drink it 3 times daily while she monitored his recovery. Within 4 days, MacLeish was back on his horse, shouting orders across the fields. Jonathan Fairmont noted this in his ledger. The slave woman Sarah has demonstrated knowledge of herbal remedies, proved useful with overseer's illness, may serve household purposes. Catherine's cough worsened through the late summer. What began as a mild irritation became a persistent racking that shook her thin frame. The Georgetown physician, Dr. Archibald Hayes, prescribed bleeding, then purging, then a tonic of his own invention that cost Jonathan £3 and did absolutely nothing. By September, Catherine could barely leave her bed. She'd grown so thin that her collarbones protruded sharply beneath her nightgown. She coughed blood into handkerchiefs that the house slaves burned in secret. Jonathan grew desperate, his worry manifesting as irritation with everyone around him. Betty suggested Sarah again. This time, Jonathan himself summoned the healer to the main house. Sarah stood in the doorway of Catherine's bedroom, taking in everything with those observant eyes. The windows kept closed despite the heat, the chamber pot that smelled of infection, the pale, damp skin, the shallow, rapid breathing. She stepped closer, placed her hand on Catherine's forehead, then her chest, then her back, feeling for something that couldn't be seen. "She needs air," Sarah said. Her voice was surprisingly clear, with an accent that suggested origins farther north. "Clean air, and the windows must open." "The physician said drafts would worsen her condition," Jonathan protested. Sarah looked at him directly, a moment of eye contact that would have earned most enslaved people a strike. "The physician is wrong." Perhaps it was desperation, or perhaps something in Sarah's certainty, but Jonathan ordered the windows opened. Sarah returned that evening with bundles of plants wrapped in cloth. She boiled water in the kitchen, an act that scandalized the cook who ran that domain, and steeped leaves and roots in careful proportions. The resulting tea smelled of mint and something sharper, almost medicinal. She made Catherine drink it 3 times daily. She also mixed a paste that she instructed be rubbed on Catherine's chest and back before sleep. Most importantly, she insisted Catherine sit outside on the piazza for 2 hours each morning and evening, breathing the river air. Dr. Hayes, when he learned of this treatment, pronounced it dangerous superstition and warned Jonathan that he was risking his wife's life by allowing a slave's ministrations. But Catherine was dying under Hayes's care, so Jonathan continued Sarah's regimen. 3 weeks later, Catherine walked downstairs to dinner. 4 weeks later, her cough had diminished to occasional clearing. 6 weeks later, she asked for her sewing basket, a sure sign of returning strength. The story spread through Georgetown society with the speed of scandal. The Fairmont slave who'd saved Catherine's life became a topic of parlor conversation. Other plantation families began sending for her, always carefully, always with the proper permissions negotiated between owners, because a skilled slave's time was valuable property. Sarah treated Rebecca Thornton's infant son when he developed a fever that 3 doctors couldn't break. She cured Samuel Hartwell's persistent headaches that had plagued him for years. She helped Ann Colleton's elderly mother when nobody believed the woman would survive the winter. She treated infected wounds, delivered babies, eased the pain of those dying from ailments nobody could cure, and turned away no one who came to her with genuine need. The enslaved community watched this development with mixed feelings. Sarah's gifts brought her privileges: better food, a private room in one of the cabins, exemption from field work. But gifts that made you valuable to white owners were dangerous. Valuable property was guarded closely, controlled tightly, and property that became too important, too independent, too confident in its own worth, that property needed to be reminded of its place. Sarah kept careful records, though she couldn't write. She notched a small piece of wood for each person she treated, marking whether they were enslaved or free, whether they survived or died. By her count, she'd successfully treated 33 people by the spring of 1748. The 34th would change everything. His name was Benjamin, and he was Jonathan Fairmont's only son, born in 1743 when Catherine was 28, and everyone had begun to assume she'd remain childless. The boy was indulged, adored, the center of both parents' lives and the future of the Fairmont plantation. He was 5 years old when he developed a fever in April 1748. Sarah examined him with her usual care. The fever was high, but not dangerously so. His symptoms suggested a common childhood illness. She'd seen it dozens of times in the slave quarters. She prepared her remedies: fever-reducing tea, cool compresses, specific herbs to prevent the illness from settling into his lungs. She instructed Betty on the exact schedule of treatments. But Jonathan, panicked by his son's illness, also summoned Dr. Hayes. The physician arrived the next morning, examined Benjamin, and prescribed his standard treatment, bleeding to release the bad humors. Sarah, when she learned of this, objected. She found Jonathan in his study and spoke with an urgency that approached impertinence. "The bleeding will weaken him. He needs his strength to fight the fever. Please, just continue what I've started. 3 more days, and he'll recover." Dr. Hayes, overhearing this exchange, turned purple with rage. "You dare question my medical judgment? I studied at Edinburgh University. I have treated patients across 2 continents. And you, a slave woman with some hedge-witch knowledge of weeds, presume to countermand my professional opinion?" The confrontation escalated. Dr. Hayes insisted that Jonathan must choose either Hayes's educated treatment or Sarah's plantation superstitions, but not both. To continue with Sarah's remedies while rejecting Hayes's advice would be to publicly humiliate a respected physician, an insult no gentleman could permit. Jonathan chose Dr. Hayes. He ordered Sarah back to the quarters and specifically forbade her from entering the main house. Dr. Hayes bled Benjamin twice over the next 2 days. The boy grew weaker, his fever spiking higher. On the 3rd day, he developed a rash that Hayes interpreted as evidence the bad humors were being expelled. On the fourth day, Benjamin couldn't keep down water. On the fifth day, he died. Catherine's screams could be heard across the plantation. Jonathan sat in his study and drank himself into a stupor. Dr. Hayes, after examining the body, declared that the boy had succumbed to a malignant fever beyond any treatment's reach and collected his fee before departing. In the slave quarters, Sarah wept for a child she couldn't save because they wouldn't let her try. The funeral took place on a grey morning with half of Georgetown society in attendance. Catherine, dressed in black that made her look ghostly, could barely stand. Jonathan's face had set into a mask of rage that needed a target. 3 days after they buried Benjamin, that target revealed itself. The accusation began quietly, like poison seeping into water. Dr. Hayes, during a dinner at the Thornton plantation, mentioned casually that he'd always found it peculiar how the slave Sarah's remedies seemed to work so effectively. Almost unnatural, he mused, swirling wine in his glass. One wonders what precisely goes into those concoctions of hers. Rebecca Thornton, whose infant son Sarah had saved years earlier, felt a chill of unease. What if Sarah's healing wasn't medicine, but something darker? She'd never actually seen what Sarah put in those teas and pastes. Nobody had. The whisper spread through Georgetown society like fever through an unventilated sick room. Sarah's remedies worked too well to be simple herbalism. There must be something else, some secret knowledge, some pact or power that exceeded normal human ability. And if she could heal with such effectiveness, couldn't she also harm? Hadn't Benjamin Fairmont died after Sarah's remedies were stopped? What if the remedies themselves had caused a dependency, a corruption in the boy's body that made him vulnerable once they were withdrawn? What if Sarah had been slowly poisoning him all along for reasons only she understood? The theological implications were discussed in parlor conversations across the region. South Carolina had no history of witch trials like Massachusetts, but the colonists knew the stories. They knew that Satan worked through human instruments, often choosing society's most vulnerable, women, servants, slaves, to do his bidding. Wasn't it suspicious that a slave woman possessed knowledge that exceeded trained physicians? Where could such knowledge come from, except a supernatural source? Jonathan Fairmont, drowning in grief and rage, seized on these whispers like a drowning man grasping at driftwood. His son was dead. Someone must be responsible. And if Sarah's healing had always been devilish rather than divine, then she'd been corrupting his household for 17 years. Perhaps Catherine's recovery had been false, a temporary reprieve granted by dark powers to lull them into trust. Perhaps every cure she'd performed had extracted some spiritual price that would eventually be collected. On May 3, 1748, Jonathan filed a formal complaint with the Georgetown magistrate, accusing Sarah of practicing witchcraft, of using diabolical arts and poisonous substances to achieve her cures, and of deliberately causing his son's death through supernatural means. The charge was legally absurd. South Carolina had no witchcraft statutes, and the colonial government generally discouraged such prosecutions as primitive superstition. But the magistrate, a wealthy planter himself, who'd lost 2 slaves to mysterious illnesses the previous year, agreed to investigate. Sarah was arrested on May 5th. They came at dawn, 3 men led by McLeish the overseer, who seemed to take particular pleasure in finally exerting authority over someone who'd always made him vaguely uncomfortable. They found her in her cabin, awake. She always rose before dawn, grinding herbs with her stone pestle. The leather pouch she wore around her neck was removed and searched. Inside they found dried leaves of several plants, small roots wrapped in cloth, a piece of quartz crystal, and a small book, handwritten, its pages covered in notes and drawings of plants. "She can write," McLeish said, genuinely shocked. "A slave who can write." Literacy among enslaved people was illegal in South Carolina, punishable by whipping, but that transgression paled beside the witchcraft accusation. The book, written in a mixture of English and another language nobody recognized, was presented as evidence of her occult knowledge. They took her to Georgetown in shackles, an unnecessary cruelty as she made no attempt to resist, and locked her in the jail behind the courthouse. The building was brick, recently constructed, with 3 cells and iron doors that were supposed to represent the advance of civilization into the wilderness. The trial, such as it was, took place over 2 days in late May. Dr. Hayes testified that Sarah's remedies violated natural law and medical science. Rebecca Thornton testified that Sarah had always seemed uncanny in her abilities. Other witnesses came forward with stories. Sarah had once predicted which plantation slave would become ill before any symptoms appeared. She'd found water during a drought by walking through the woods, as if led by invisible guidance. She'd once looked at a pregnant woman and known the child would be born with a defect, and she'd been correct. Each story, innocent in isolation, accumulated into a portrait of someone who possessed knowledge beyond human capacity. Sarah was not permitted to testify in her own defense. Slaves couldn't give testimony against white citizens. But the magistrate, troubled by the proceedings' irregular nature, asked if she had anything to say regarding the charges. She stood in the courtroom, still wearing the plain gray dress she'd been arrested in, and spoke clearly. "I learned healing from my mother, who learned from her mother. Every plant has properties. Every illness has patterns. I watch. I remember. I learn. There's no magic in it, only attention and care." "Then explain," the magistrate said, "how you knew Rebecca Thornton's child would survive when 3 physicians said he would die." Sarah looked at him steadily. The physicians were draining his blood when he needed fluids. They were closing the windows when he needed air. They were treating their theories instead of watching the actual child. I watched. I saw. I acted. The child lived because I paid attention to what was real instead of what I'd been taught. The courtroom murmured at this near insolence. The magistrate frowned. Dr. Hayes looked furious. The verdict came quickly. Guilty of practicing witchcraft and causing death through supernatural means. The sentence handed down on May 28th was death by burning, to be carried out at dawn on June 1st. Catherine Fairmont, when she heard the verdict, took to her bed and wouldn't speak. Jonathan drank and told himself justice had been served. The enslaved community at Fairmont said nothing aloud but gathered in the evenings to whisper prayers and fears. In her cell, Sarah sat with her back against the cold brick and calculated her chances of survival. The jailkeeper was a man named Hosea Jenkins, 43 years old, who supplemented his meager government salary by running a small cooperative business in his spare time. He was not a cruel man by nature, but neither was he particularly compassionate. Prisoners were prisoners, and his job was to keep them locked up until the law decided otherwise. Sarah was his only current prisoner. Georgetown was small enough that serious crime remained rare. He brought her food twice daily, corn mush in the morning, rice and beans in the evening, water when she asked. He rarely spoke to her except to announce when he was opening the cell door. But on the evening of May 29th, 2 days before her scheduled execution, Jenkins found Sarah sitting cross-legged in her cell, eyes closed, lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been something else. When he set down her food, she opened her eyes and looked at him. "Your daughter suffers from headaches," she said. Jenkins froze. His daughter Martha, aged 11, did indeed suffer from terrible headaches that left her bedridden for days at a time. But he'd told no one in Georgetown about this. It was family business, private, and besides, who could help? "How do you know about Martha?" he asked. "You have lines around your eyes that come from worry, not age. You carry the smell of feverfew. You've been trying to treat someone with it, but feverfew alone won't help if the headaches come from pressure in the skull. You need willow bark tea mixed with feverfew given at the onset of pain, not after it's established. And she should sleep with her head elevated on 2 pillows instead of 1. Jenkins stared at her. "You're about to burn for witchcraft, and you're giving me medical advice?" I'm about to burn for healing people, Sarah corrected. There's a difference. That night, Jenkins went home and prepared the tea exactly as Sarah described. When Martha's headache began the next morning, he could always tell by how she squinted at the light. He gave her the tea and elevated her head. Within an hour, the pain receded instead of building. By afternoon, Martha was up and playing with her younger brothers. Jenkins sat in his small house that evening and wrestled with his conscience. The law said Sarah would burn. The court had decided. But the law had also said that healing his daughter's pain was witchcraft, and if that was witchcraft, then the law itself was sick. He made a decision that would cost him everything. On the evening of May 31st, after darkness fell, Jenkins visited Sarah's cell. "I'm going to unlock this door," he said quietly. "In 10 minutes, I'll be in my office, facing away from the cells, examining ledgers that require my complete attention. What happens after that is between you and God." Sarah stood. "They'll know you helped. They'll suspect. They won't prove. I'm a free man. They can't torture a confession out of me, and I'll have plausible story about falling asleep at my desk." He paused. "My Martha is 11 years old. Before you treated her headaches, she spent half her life in pain. That's worth my job, maybe worth more. Where should I go? North. Follow the river inland, away from the plantations. There are places in the backcountry where nobody asks questions, where people need healing and don't care where it comes from. You'll find help if you're careful." He handed her a small bundle. "Food, a knife, flint. It's all I can spare." Just when we thought the story would end at the stake, one man's conscience changed everything. If you're gripped by this tale of courage and impossible choices, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this video with someone who loves true historical mysteries. And drop a comment with your theory. Do you think Sarah made it to freedom? Or did they catch her before dawn? Let's find out what happened next together. At midnight on June 1st, Sarah walked out of her cell. She moved through the darkened jail like smoke, making no sound. Jenkins sat at his desk, his back to the cells, his hands trembling slightly as he pretended to review supply ledgers by candlelight. She paused at his door. "Thank you," she said softly. He didn't turn around. "Go." Sarah disappeared into the Carolina night. Dawn came precisely at 5:47 a.m. on June 1st, 1748. The execution was scheduled for 6 Gao, giving the condemned time to make final prayers. When Jenkins arrived at the cell to escort Sarah to the stake that had been prepared in the courthouse square, he performed his role with convincing shock and alarm. "She's gone. The prisoner has escaped." The magistrate was summoned from his bed. Jonathan Fairmont arrived within 20 minutes, still buttoning his coat. Dr. Hayes came to observe and provide medical expertise should anyone be injured during the search. Half of Georgetown's free population gathered to witness the scandal. The cell was examined thoroughly. The lock showed no signs of tampering because it had been opened with a key. The iron door hung properly on its hinges. The window, a narrow slit barely wide enough for a child to squeeze through, remained barred and secure. There was no tunnel, no loosened stones, no hidden passage. She simply vanished. Someone whispered, and the word spread through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Vanished, like smoke, like a demon summoned back to hell. A search party was organized immediately. McLeish, who prided himself on tracking skills learned from Indian traders, led a dozen men into the woods north of Georgetown. They found no tracks, no broken branches, no sign of passage. It was as if Sarah had simply ceased to exist the moment she left the cell. "Witchcraft," Dr. Hayes pronounced, "clear evidence that our judgment was correct. Only supernatural powers could accomplish such an escape." The magistrate, examining the cell personally, found himself troubled by a different question. If she could vanish through witchcraft, why wait until the night before execution? Why not escape immediately upon arrest? Nobody had a good answer to this. The question hung in the air, uncomfortable and unanswered. Jonathan Fairmont offered a reward, £50 sterling for Sarah's capture, dead or alive. It was an enormous sum, enough to buy several slaves or a small plot of land. Bounty hunters arrived from Charleston, men who specialized in tracking escaped slaves through swamp and forest. They searched for 2 weeks and found nothing. At the Fairmont plantation, strange things began happening. Not supernatural, nothing that couldn't be explained, but unsettling nonetheless. The rice crop, usually reliable, began failing in one section of fields. McLeish investigated and found the trunk gates sabotaged, allowing salt water to flood the paddies at the wrong time. Someone with knowledge of rice cultivation had done it deliberately. A fire started in one of the storage barns, destroying that season's seed rice. The cause was never determined, but the burn pattern suggested it began in multiple places simultaneously. Horses fell lame. Tools went missing. A section of fence collapsed, allowing several pigs to escape into the forest. Each incident could be accident or negligence. Taken together, they felt like revenge. The enslaved community at Fairmont moved through their work with careful neutrality, showing neither satisfaction nor concern. But in the quarters at night, they sang songs that hadn't been heard in years. Old songs from across the ocean, songs about tricksters and freedom, songs about those who escaped bondage through cunning rather than violence. Jonathan began drinking more heavily. Catherine withdrew into silence, spending hours in Benjamin's empty room. The plantation, once prosperous, began declining, not catastrophically but steadily, like a wound that wouldn't quite heal. Dr. Hayes published a pamphlet, an account of witchcraft in the Carolina Lowcountry, being a true relation of the escape of the witch woman Sarah through diabolical arts. It sold briskly in Charleston and Savannah, establishing Hayes's reputation as an expert on supernatural matters. He never mentioned that he'd been wrong about Benjamin's treatment, or that Sarah's remedies had proven more effective than his own. In Georgetown, the jail lock was changed. Jenkins was questioned extensively but stuck to his story. He'd been working at his desk and had dozed off briefly. When he woke, the cell was empty. How? He didn't know. Must have been witchcraft, just like everyone said. The magistrate didn't believe him but couldn't prove otherwise. Jenkins kept his position, though his reputation never fully recovered. His daughter Martha's headaches, however, remained manageable for the rest of her life. 2 months after Sarah's escape, a traveling merchant passing through Georgetown mentioned that he'd heard stories from the backcountry about a woman healer who'd settled near a Cherokee trading path, treating both colonists and Indians with equal skill. She was described as tall, with observant eyes and hands that moved with peculiar precision when working with plants. The magistrate sent inquiries but received no cooperation. The backcountry operated by different rules, and a skilled healer, whatever her legal status, was too valuable to surrender for any reward. The truth about Sarah's escape remained hidden until 1779, when Hosea Jenkins lay dying of the fever that had plagued Georgetown that summer. With death approaching and conscience weighing heavy, he sent for his pastor and made a confession. "I let her go," he said, his voice weak but clear. "I opened the cell and gave her supplies and directions. She didn't vanish through witchcraft. She walked out through an unlocked door while I pretended not to notice." The pastor, Reverend Samuel Blackwell, was shocked. "You allowed a convicted witch to escape?" "I allowed a healer who saved my daughter's life to avoid execution for the crime of being better at medicine than the men who charge money for it." Jenkins coughed, the sound wet and painful. "She wasn't a witch. She was a woman who paid attention to the world around her and learned from it. We burned her because she made educated men feel inadequate, and because she was enslaved and therefore couldn't be allowed to possess knowledge that exceeded her masters." But Jenkins had more to confess than just opening a door. In his fever-weakened state, 30 years of carried guilt poured out in fragments that Reverend Blackwell struggled to piece together. Sarah hadn't been entirely unprepared for her escape, Jenkins revealed. During her month of imprisonment, she'd had one regular visitor besides Jenkins himself, a free black woman named Phyllis Rutherford, who operated a small bakery in Georgetown, supplying bread to the courthouse and jail. Phyllis was one of perhaps 24 free people of color living in the district. her freedom purchased years earlier by a grateful merchant whose life she'd saved through skilled nursing during a yellow fever outbreak. Phyllis had known Sarah before the arrest. Years earlier, Sarah had helped Phyllis's sister through a difficult childbirth at one of the neighboring plantations. The baby had been breech, and the white midwife had given up, declaring both mother and child lost. Sarah had been summoned as a last resort. Through careful manipulation and patience that lasted 8 hours, she'd turned the baby and delivered him alive. The mother survived. Phyllis never forgot. When Sarah was arrested, Phyllis began visiting the jail under the pretense of delivering fresh bread, an unnecessary luxury that she claimed was Christian charity for the condemned. She would sit outside Sarah's cell and read scripture aloud, as was considered proper. But within those scripture readings, she embedded information. Names of safe houses, descriptions of landmarks along escape routes, warnings about which roads had patrol stations. Jenkins had known about these communications but chose ignorance. His role was to keep prisoners locked up, not to monitor every word spoken through the bars. When he made the decision to unlock Sarah's cell, he knew she wouldn't be walking into complete darkness. Phyllis had already mapped the path, but there was more. In the 2 days between Sarah's escape and Jenkins's official discovery of the empty cell, a conspiracy of silence had operated across Georgetown that nobody ever fully acknowledged. The night watchman who should have been patrolling near the jail reported seeing nothing unusual. The merchant whose stable backed up to the jail property didn't hear when someone took one of his horses, a mare with a gentle temperament, gone for 3 days, and then mysteriously returned. The ferryman at the river crossing north of town somehow failed to notice a tall woman crossing just before dawn. "We weren't all heartless," Jenkins whispered. "Some of us knew the trial was wrong. We couldn't stop it." The magistrate had decided. Dr. Hayes had testified. Jonathan Fairmont wanted blood. But we could choose not to see certain things. We could choose to be looking the wrong direction at the right moment. Reverend Blackwell asked the question that would haunt him. How many others were involved? Jenkins's answer was both specific and vague. Count the people in Georgetown whose lives she saved. Then count how many of them testified against her. The difference is your answer. Of the 33 people Sarah had successfully treated, only 3 had testified at her trial. 30 others had remained silent, neither defending nor condemning her. But silence, Jenkins suggested, wasn't always cowardice. Sometimes it was calculated restraint, the decision not to add your voice to either side so that later, if opportunity came, you could act without having committed yourself publicly. Jenkins died that evening before he could provide more names. Reverend Blackwell was left with a confession that implicated dozens of Georgetown citizens in a conspiracy to undermine a legal execution. He struggled with what to do about this knowledge. The Revolutionary War was in full chaos in 1779. British forces controlled much of South Carolina. Georgetown itself would change hands multiple times over the next 2 years. In the midst of this upheaval, prosecuting people for a 30-year-old mercy seemed absurd. More than absurd. It seemed like precisely the kind of rigid adherence to law over justice that the revolution itself was supposedly fighting against. Blackwell made a decision that would define his ministry. He recorded Jenkins's confession in his private journal but took no official action. He did, however, begin asking quiet questions about what had happened to the woman who'd escaped. This investigation led him to Phyllis Rutherford, now in her 60s and still operating her bakery, despite the war's disruptions. When Blackwell approached her after Sunday services and mentioned Jenkins's deathbed confession, Phyllis studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Walk with me, Reverend." They walked along the riverfront, away from listening ears. Phyllis spoke in a low voice about a network that nobody acknowledged, but everyone knew existed. A loose organization of free black people, sympathetic white citizens, and trusted enslaved individuals who helped move people to safety when the law became an instrument of injustice rather than protection. "We didn't do it often," Phyllis said. "Couldn't. Each escape made the next one harder, made the authorities more suspicious. But sometimes a case was so clearly wrong that silence became impossible. Sarah was one of those cases. Phyllis revealed details that Jenkins hadn't known. The escape route had been planned for 2 weeks before Jenkins made his decision. They'd been waiting for him, or someone like him, to provide the opening. If Jenkins hadn't unlocked the door, they'd found a blacksmith willing to forge a key. If that failed, they'd identified a weak point in the jail's brick wall that could be breached with tools and time. One way or another, Sarah would not have burned. "You have to understand," Phyllis said. "By 1748, we'd all seen what happened when knowledge met fear. Sarah's crime wasn't witchcraft. It was competence. She made educated white men look incompetent, and worse, she did it while enslaved. That combination couldn't be tolerated. If they'd burned her, what message would that send? That any enslaved person with skills exceeding their station could be executed on supernatural charges? We couldn't allow that precedent." Reverend Blackwell asked the question that mattered most. "Did she survive? Did she make it to freedom?" Phyllis smiled but didn't answer directly. "I received a letter once, years after the escape. It came through Charleston, passed hand to hand until it reached me. No signature, no return address. But I knew the hand that wrote it. I'd seen Sarah's plant drawings, and the handwriting matched. The letter thanked me for the scripture readings that summer, said she'd found the passages particularly illuminating. That was all. But it was enough. The existence of this letter was significant. If Sarah had survived to write it, she'd not only reached safety, but had maintained her literacy. A dangerous thing for any black person in the South, enslaved or free, and evidence of remarkable determination. She'd also maintained connections, knew who could be trusted to carry messages across state lines without asking too many questions. Reverend Blackwell pressed for more details about Sarah's destination, her life after escape. Phyllis shook her head. That knowledge died with the people who had it. Safer that way. The less any one person knows, the less they can reveal under pressure. She paused. "But I heard stories over the years, rumors from travelers. Talk of a black medicine woman in the backcountry who treated everyone equally. Cherokee, Creek, white settlers, escaped slaves, free black families. Some said she'd married a Cherokee trader. Others claimed she lived alone, independent, beholden to no one. The stories contradicted each other, which probably means at least some were true." Before they parted, Phyllis asked Blackwell what he intended to do with Jenkins's confession. The Reverend was honest. He didn't know. Phyllis offered advice. "The war will end eventually. When it does, we'll build something new, or try to. That new country will need to decide what kind of justice it wants. The old kind, where law protects power and property above all else, or something better. Your journal, Reverend, with Jenkins's confession and this conversation, keep it. Someday, someone will need to know that even in dark times, some people chose mercy over law. That will matter more than you think." Reverend Blackwell took her advice. His journal remained in his family's possession, a private document recording the moral complexities that official histories preferred to ignore. But the ripples of Sarah's case extended beyond Georgetown. In the years following her escape, South Carolina saw a notable decline in witchcraft accusations. This wasn't due to growing rationality alone, though the Enlightenment was influencing colonial thought, but because Sarah's disappearance had demonstrated the practical problems with such prosecutions. If accused witches could escape through supernatural means, what was the point of trials? And if they escaped through human aid, as some suspected, then the social consensus needed for executions was clearly lacking. Dr. Hayes's pamphlet about Sarah's case, published in 1749, had actually worked against its author's intentions. Rather than establishing Hayes as an expert on supernatural matters, it made him look credulous and superstitious. Educated readers in Charleston and Savannah, influenced by European scientific thinking, mocked his conclusions. One satirical response, published in the South Carolina Gazette in 1750, suggested that perhaps Dr. Hayes's medical treatments were the real witchcraft, given how many patients survived by avoiding his care. Hayes's medical practice declined steadily after this controversy. By 1755, he'd lost most of his wealthy patients. The lawsuit that ended his career in 1763 was almost merciful. It gave him an excuse to retire rather than admit he'd been abandoned by the very society he'd tried to defend against supposed supernatural threats. Meanwhile, at Fairmont Plantation, the consequences of Sarah's trial and escape continued to manifest in ways that couldn't be easily explained. The section of rice fields that had been sabotaged never recovered full productivity, but that was understandable given the salt contamination. What was less easily explained was the pattern of misfortune that seemed to follow Jonathan Fairmont specifically. His slaves didn't run away more than others. Escape from low-country rice plantations was notoriously difficult given the geography and patrols, but they worked with a kind of deliberate inefficiency that was impossible to punish because it left no clear evidence. Tools weren't missing, they just broke more often. Repairs were completed, they just needed to be redone more frequently. Work was finished. It just took longer than before. McLeish, the overseer, noted this in his reports but couldn't identify specific culprits. The enslaved community at Fairmont had closed ranks in a way that transcended individual personality. They weren't rebellious, that would bring violent punishment. They were simply less enthusiastic, less invested in the plantation's success. And in an economy that depended on enslaved people caring enough about their work to do it well, this quiet disengagement was devastating. Jonathan tried increasing punishments, then tried reducing them. He tried offering incentives, then tried rotating work assignments. Nothing changed the fundamental dynamic. His slaves would work exactly as hard as necessary to avoid punishment, and not a fraction more. Catherine, for her part, never recovered from Benjamin's death. She'd initially blamed Sarah. That was easier than blaming her husband for choosing Dr. Hayes over effective treatment. But as months became years, she couldn't maintain the delusion. Benjamin had been dying under Hayes's care, improving under Sarah's. Her son's death was the price of social convention, of deference to credentialed authority over practical results. She began having dreams, not supernatural visions, just the ordinary nightmares of grief and guilt. In these dreams, Benjamin lived because she'd had the courage to defy Jonathan and Dr. Hayes, to insist that Sarah continue treatment regardless of social consequences. She'd wake crying, knowing that maternal instinct had been right and social propriety had been fatal. In 1754, Catherine convinced Jonathan to free 3 of their slaves, an elderly couple and a skilled carpenter, an unprecedented act of manumission for the Fairmonts. Jonathan agreed partly to please his increasingly fragile wife, partly because the slaves in question were past prime working age, and partly because some desperate part of him hoped that demonstrating mercy might lift the atmosphere of quiet condemnation that had settled over his property. It didn't help. The remaining enslaved people at Fairmont acknowledged the manumissions with the same careful neutrality they applied to everything. They weren't impressed by mercy that came 8 years late and benefited people already too old for hard labor. The final piece of Sarah's story emerged from multiple sources over many decades, each adding fragments to a picture that would never be complete but could at least approach truth. The first substantial information came from the Cherokee oral history that Tsali shared with the missionary in 1802. But there was more to Tsali's account than the missionary recorded in his official report. In private conversation, Tsali provided details he considered too sensitive for public record. Rachel, as Sarah had renamed herself, arrived in Cherokee territory in the late summer of 1748, carried by a network of guides who moved her from safe house to safe house along routes used for trading and communication. She was exhausted, traumatized, and determined never to be property again. The Cherokee had complex relationships with escaped slaves. Some tribes returned runaways for reward money. Others offered shelter, recognizing kindred spirits in people fleeing white authority. The decision usually depended on individual circumstances and the usefulness of the person seeking refuge. Rachel proved extraordinarily useful. Within weeks of arrival, she treated a respected elder's chronic joint pain with techniques that Cherokee healers acknowledged worked better than their traditional approaches. She learned Cherokee medical practices in exchange for teaching her own knowledge, a genuine trade between equals that she'd never experienced in colonial society. She wept the first time someone asked her opinion rather than ordered her action. Sally told the missionary, "We didn't understand why until she explained what her life had been before. Then we understood that what we considered normal human respect was something she'd been denied for most of her existence." Rachel lived among the Cherokee for about 5 years, from 1748 to approximately 1753. During this time, she married, not a Cherokee man as some rumors suggested, but another refugee, a mixed-race trader named William Crawford who'd been fleeing debt charges and discrimination from white settlements. Their marriage was never legally recognized by colonial authorities, but within the Cherokee community and the loose network of backcountry settlers who didn't ask too many questions, they were simply William and Rachel, a married couple who kept to themselves and helped their neighbors. They had no children. Whether by choice, circumstance, or biological inability, the records don't say. But Rachel helped deliver dozens of children in the backcountry, both Cherokee and settler. Her reputation spread across territories that had no newspapers or official communication networks, spread by the oldest form of advertising, grateful parents telling their friends about the woman who'd saved their babies. In 1753, William died in a hunting accident, a genuine accident, nothing suspicious, just the everyday dangers of backcountry life. Rachel buried him on a hillside he'd loved, beneath an oak tree they'd planted together the year they married. She chose to stay in the area rather than return to Cherokee territory, building a small cabin on unclaimed land that nobody bothered to dispute because it was too far from anything valuable. For the next 11 years, until her death in 1764, Rachel operated as an independent medical practitioner in a region where independence was possible precisely because official authority rarely reached. She treated Cherokee families, white settlers, escaped slaves seeking refuge, free black families establishing farms, mixed-race communities existing in legal gray areas, anyone who needed help and showed respect. She maintained her literacy, carefully recording treatments and observations in the notebook that would later surface in 1856. The notebook reveals a mind that never stopped learning, never stopped refining techniques, never stopped questioning why remedies worked or didn't. She experimented with different preparation methods for the same plants, documented seasonal variations in effectiveness, noted which treatments worked better for children than adults, recorded the warning signs that suggested when conventional remedies wouldn't be enough. The notebook also contained personal observations that revealed Rachel's psychological state. One entry from 1758, treated white settler family today. Father called me ma'am and paid in smoked venison. Such simple respect still surprises me. I have been free for 10 years, yet I still expect orders and blows. I wonder if this expectation ever fully disappears, or if trauma carves permanent channels in the mind that freedom cannot entirely erase. Another entry, undated but presumably from the early 1760s, reflected today on the 33 lives I saved before they called me witch. I have saved at least 200 more since then, probably more that I've lost count of. The difference is that now people thank me instead of fearing me. The medicine hasn't changed. My knowledge hasn't changed. Only my legal status and the color of my patient's desperation has changed. This tells me everything I need to know about which was real, the crime they accused me of, or the crime they committed against me. Sally's account of Rachel's death was both tragic and fitting. In February 1764, one of the worst winters in Carolina memory, a woman in a settlement 2 days' walk from Rachel's cabin went into premature labor. The husband arrived at Rachel's door during a blizzard, begging for help. Rachel, now approximately 60 years old, gathered her supplies and went. The journey took 8 hours through snow that reached their knees. By the time they arrived, the woman was in crisis. Rachel worked through the night, managing a complicated delivery that should have killed both mother and child. Through skill, experience, and determination that transcended physical exhaustion, she delivered a healthy baby girl just before dawn. The mother survived. The baby survived. Rachel, who'd walked through a blizzard at age 60 and worked through the night in a freezing cabin, developed pneumonia. She died 4 days later, her last words reportedly, "The baby lives, that's what matters." The Cherokee community and the scattered backcountry settlers who'd known her pooled resources to give her a proper burial. They laid her to rest on the hillside she'd chosen, next to William, beneath the oak tree. Over 100 people attended. Cherokee, white settlers, free black families, and several people who'd clearly been enslaved but were visiting relatives for the weekend, a transparent fiction that everyone politely accepted. One of these visitors was a young man named Isaac, who'd traveled from a plantation near Charleston. In a letter he later wrote to his brother, a letter that was preserved in a collection of African-American correspondence and rediscovered in 1934. Isaac described attending Rachel's funeral and hearing stories about her life. "They say she was born enslaved," Isaac wrote. "They say she was nearly burned for healing people. They say she escaped and lived free for 16 years, healing hundreds more. I do not know if all these stories are true, but I stood by her grave and saw people of 3 different colors weeping together, and I thought, if this woman could earn such respect from such different people, then surely the world is capable of more justice than we currently see. Her grave gives me hope, brother. If she could escape and live free, perhaps others can too. Perhaps someday all of us can." This letter, along with Sally's account and Rachel's recovered notebook, formed the core evidence that historian Margaret Hensley used in her 1926 dissertation. But Hensley's research uncovered additional pieces that deepened the picture. Hensley discovered, for instance, that Phyllis Rutherford's bakery in Georgetown had operated continuously until 1802, when Phyllis died at age 87. In her will, Phyllis left a sum of money, surprisingly large for a free black woman of her era, to establish a fund for the medical education of deserving persons regardless of their status or color. The fund was never actually implemented, blocked by legal challenges from white citizens who objected to using money for black education. But the intention was clear. Phyllis had spent decades saving money to create what Sarah had represented: access to medical knowledge for people systematically excluded from it. Hensley also tracked down descendants of Hosea Jenkins and interviewed his great-great-granddaughter in 1924. The family had preserved not just Jenkins's memory as the jailkeeper who let the witch escape, but also a more complex understanding of his motivations. Jenkins' daughter Martha, whose headache Sarah had cured, lived until 1809. She'd told her own children and grandchildren about Sarah, ensuring that the family memory preserved the healer rather than the witch. Great-great-grandmother Martha said Sarah wasn't magic. Jenkins's descendant told Hensley. She said Sarah just paid attention to things that doctors ignored. She said Sarah looked at her, really looked, and asked questions about when the headaches came, what made them worse, what made them better. Nobody had ever asked her those questions before. The doctors just bled her and charged money. Sarah listened and helped. That was her crime, apparently, being too good at noticing. Perhaps most significantly, Hensley discovered evidence that Sarah's medical techniques had spread far beyond the backcountry where Rachel had practiced. In plantation records, family journals, and medical accounts from across the South, Hensley found recurring references to enslaved healers using techniques that matched Sarah's methods, techniques that were notably more effective than contemporary medical practice. This suggested that Sarah hadn't been unique. She'd been part of a broader tradition of African and African American medical knowledge that enslaved communities preserved and transmitted despite systematic efforts to suppress it. Her trial and escape had simply made her visible in a way that threatened white authority. The leather pouch taken from Sarah during her arrest, the one that had been stored in the Georgetown courthouse until the building burned in 1779, had actually been retrieved before the fire. Hensley discovered a reference to it in a 1777 estate inventory. A Georgetown doctor named James Pemberley had somehow acquired one leather pouch containing dried herbs and roots, said to have belonged to the witch woman Sarah, kept as curiosity. Pemberley died in 1778, and his estate was liquidated to pay debts. The pouch was purchased by a medical student from Charleston who was fascinated by folk remedies. That student, William Drayton, became a physician who incorporated some of what he'd learned from studying Sarah's herbs into his own practice. In his personal journal, Drayton wrote, "Examined the contents of the so-called witch's pouch today. Found specimens of willow bark, feverfew, and several other botanicals. Tested their properties and found them remarkably effective for various ailments." Either this woman was remarkably lucky in her plant selection, or she possessed knowledge that exceeded my expensive medical education. I suspect the latter, which troubles me more than I care to admit. By the time Hensley published her dissertation in 1926, she'd accumulated enough evidence to conclusively demonstrate that Sarah had been a skilled medical practitioner, that her escape had been aided by multiple people who recognized an injustice, and that her influence had persisted long after her death through the treatment she'd pioneered and the people she'd trained. Hensley's work was largely ignored by mainstream historians, partly because it centered a black woman's story in an era when such histories were considered marginal, partly because it complicated the narrative of steady medical progress that the profession preferred. But it found an audience among medical historians, anthropologists studying folk medicine, and the growing field of African American history. In 1956, a historical marker was placed near the site where Rachel's cabin had stood. By then long gone, reclaimed by forest. The marker read, "Near this site lived a healer known as Rachel, believed to be Sarah of Georgetown, who escaped execution for witchcraft in 1748 and practiced medicine among Cherokee and settler communities until her death in 1764. She represents the many black healers whose knowledge preserved lives and challenged authority in early America." The marker lasted until 1965, when vandals destroyed it. It was never replaced. But the destruction sparked a local effort to preserve the oral histories of backcountry medicine, resulting in a collection of recorded interviews with elderly residents who remembered stories their grandparents had told about various healers, including a tall black woman with careful hands and observant eyes, who'd lived alone but was never lonely, who'd asked for little but given much, who'd be and called a witch by people who feared her, and a savior by people who knew her. In Georgetown itself, the story of Sarah evolved over centuries. By the 1820s, she'd become a campfire story, a witch who escaped through magic, a cautionary tale about dabbling in dark arts. By the 1920s, she'd been largely forgotten, a footnote in local histories. By the 1980s, after Hensley's research had slowly percolated through academic circles and into public consciousness, she'd been reclaimed as a symbol of resistance and knowledge persisting against oppression. In 2003, the Georgetown County Historical Society issued a formal statement acknowledging that Sarah's trial had been a miscarriage of justice, that her medical knowledge had been genuine and valuable, and that her persecution represented a shameful chapter in local history. The statement stopped short of an official apology. Authorities in 2003 couldn't apologize for actions taken by different authorities in 1748, but it represented a shift in how the community understood its own past. What do you think of Sarah's story? Do you believe justice was ever truly served, or did she simply survive an injustice that was never properly addressed? The question of whether mercy is enough when justice fails remains relevant today. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious how this story resonates with you. If this tale of courage, knowledge, and survival moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear about historical figures who refuse to be erased. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear for more forgotten American stories that challenge what we think we know about our past. Hit that notification bell so you never miss these deep dives into the mysteries that official histories tried to bury. And remember, Sarah's real legacy wasn't escaping the stake or living free in the backcountry. Her legacy was every life she saved, every person she trained, every technique she documented, every time someone chose mercy over law, healing over authority, observation over assumption. That legacy outlived her persecution by centuries and continues to this day in how we understand the complex relationship between power, knowledge, and justice. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll uncover another story from America's shadows that deserves to be brought into the light.